So yeah, I'm really delighted today to be chairing this session, which is a celebration of the publication of a new book called Development, Dual Citizenship and Its Discontents in Africa, The Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia, published by Cambridge University Press. The author is Robtel Neajai Pailey, who is an assistant professor in social policy at the London School of Economics. It's especially gratifying for me to chair this session, since I supervised the dissertation that was the seed that this book grew out of. And I've been following Robtel for many years along this path. So it feels a bit like it's not the end of a journey, but it's certainly a milestone along the way. I'll just briefly introduce our first three speakers, and then we'll hear from them, and then I'll introduce the last two speakers. So first and foremost, Robtel is a Liberian academic and activist and author of the monograph that I've just talked about. She completed her doctorate in development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London, where she was a Mo Ibrahim Foundation PhD scholar. As I said, also, she is the assistant professor in international social and public policy at the LSE, where she conducts research on race, citizenship, South-South migration, and development cooperation. So we'll hear from Robtel first, and then we'll hear from Thabani Mutambasere, who completed his PhD in the Department of International Development at the University of Sussex, where he's also been working as a school tutor. His doctoral research explored ideas of citizenship, belonging, identity, and transnational practices amongst the Zimbabwean diaspora in the United Kingdom. Thabani recently joined the School of Geography at Queen Mary, University of London, where he's working on a postdoctoral research assistant position on a project investigating food security, mobility, and cultures in Zimbabwe. And his research interests also include humanitarianism, civil society, migration, and development. And then we'll hear from Kirstie Kwarteng, who is a storyteller, a curator of stories. She's also currently a doctoral candidate at SOAS, where we work together, and in the Department of Development Studies, and is a recipient of the Royal Geographical Society's Dudley Stamp Memorial Award. Her research interests include migration and development, African diaspora populations, and second-generation transnationalism. Prior to beginning her doctorate, she founded the Nana Project, an online platform dedicated to preserving Ghana's history through firsthand accounts of Ghana's history. First from Robtel, and then we'll hear from Thabani and Kirstie.
Thank you so much for those introductions, Laura. And you're right, we have come full circle. It was actually 10 years ago that I started the PhD at SOAS that eventually birthed this monograph. So I want to thank you for being such a stellar PhD supervisor. I also want to thank you for chairing this event. I want to also send a special shout out and thank you to Sibongile, to Thabani, to Natasha, to Kirstie for so graciously agreeing to serve as discussants for this particular book event on the sidelines of the DSA conference. So I'll begin by sharing my slides. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves so that we have a chance to listen carefully to anyone who's actually speaking. Okay, so I think everybody can see that. I will start with the slideshow. So basically what I'm going to do is, in terms of the outline of this presentation, is I want to talk about what I think are broad contributions that I'm making from this book, the theoretical contributions, the empirical contributions, as well as the methodological contributions. And then in part two, I want to talk about what I think might be implications of the book for policymaking and practice in Liberia, but also across the continent writ large, and maybe even further afield from the continent of Africa. So the first is that the case study of Liberia, which is the country that I focus on primarily, although I do make broad statements about dual citizenship, contestations in other parts of the continent of Africa. So Liberia was the first Black African republic, an incredibly unique case study. And as a result, it was really the first country in the continent of Africa to devise legal norms around citizenship, around membership, around belonging. So this book is the first study that actually investigates both domestic and diasporic constructions and practices of Liberian citizenship across space and time, and there are myriad implications for development. So we think about broader processes of political, economic, sociological change. And I do this by using a contested dual citizenship bill that lingered in legislative limbo in Liberia from 2008 to 2018. The bill was never passed, to ask broader questions about what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war country, and how does this affect people's development practices? So there are three major arguments that I make. The first is, while mid-19th century to mid-20th century Liberian citizenship was largely passive and constructed from above by a hegemonic state, mid-19th century Liberian citizenship onwards has been largely active and reconstructed from below by citizens themselves, usually through protest. Now, why is this? I look at three broad historical as well as contemporary factors: conflict, migration, as well as post-war recovery, to talk about how citizenship has been configured as well as reconfigured across space and time. So in the case of migration, for instance, in the 19th century, when Liberia was established as Africa's first Black republic, citizenship laws were largely biased against what I call the rooted indigent. So those indigenous populations that lived on the coast as well as on the hinterland were barred from benefiting from the political rights of citizenship and the economic rights of citizenship up until the mid-20th century. On the other hand, in the 21st century, Liberia is what I would consider a country of relative emigration. However, citizenship laws in the country now are biased against what I call the rootless emigrant. So those Liberians who may have left after the armed conflict of 14 years and naturalized abroad are not able to maintain their Liberian citizenship. Those Liberians who were born to Liberian citizen parents abroad are also not allowed to be both citizens of the countries of birth, but also the citizenship, or maintain the citizenship of their ancestry. Now, this isn't surprising because scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani, as well as Brahman Manby, have demonstrated that citizenship is viscerally contested in African countries that experience the greatest colonial era migration. And although Liberia didn't experience European colonization, it did experience heightened levels of colonial era migration during this process. The second argument that I make is that the 21st century gridlock or impasse on dual citizenship that we're experiencing now is actually emblematic of the sort of long enduring struggles over Liberian citizenship. Liberia happens to be one of only 7 countries in the continent of Africa that prohibits dual citizenship. The other 6 are Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The last argument that I make is that domestic and diasporic Liberian actors actually interpret citizenship and dual citizenship quite differently based on what Norman Long calls their lived experiences or their life worlds and their socioeconomic positions or their social locations. What's interesting is when I interviewed over 200 Liberians across 5 different countries, which I'll speak to about a little bit later in my methodological contribution section, I noticed that many domestic Liberians actually saw dual citizenship as a zero-sum game. They viewed it as infringing upon their already very limited access to political, economic, and social rights, and as actually reproducing inequalities in the country. On the other hand, many diasporic Liberians saw dual citizenship as enabling development, as strengthening their ties to the country so that they could become more meaningful actors, political, economic, and social actors. So we can already see this sort of polarized debate as it relates to how domestic citizens view dual citizenship and how diasporic Liberian actors view dual citizenship. What I do throughout the book is I present a sort of critical framing of citizenship as a continuum of both inclusion and exclusion, but also a critical framing of development as a process of both amelioration or progress and development, and as a process of degeneration. So I don't think of development as a taken for granted process of progress. How I define development is how people's experiences of progress, power, privilege, and poverty is actually mediated to affect change. So what I do throughout the book is I interrogate this sort of presumed symbiotic relationship that's in some of the public discourse about how there is a relationship between development and dual citizenship, that dual citizenship leads to development or that development leads to dual citizenship, to sort of present dual citizenship as effectively viscerally contested as a development intervention. So I provide critiques of dual citizenship that's in the literature. For instance, some scholars have argued that dual citizenship is effectively about extending rights without necessarily extracting responsibilities. Others have demonstrated that there actually really is no real correlation between dual citizenship enactment in certain contexts and increased economic contributions by nationals abroad. So what I do is I center the domestic citizen practices of Liberians in the country as key to socioeconomic change. And this challenges the literature that tends to privilege the citizenship claims of immigrants almost primarily or exclusively. And then lastly, I offer a post-colonial critique of the sort of neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to post-war reconstruction and post-war development. What I demonstrate is that diaspora citizenship claims are as much contested as their development claims, in the same way that donors' development claims are incredibly contested in Liberia and other countries that have experienced armed conflict or rupture or crisis. I also show that diasporas are both development enablers as well as development spoilers. And then lastly, I show that diasporas are a silver lining, but certainly not a silver bullet, especially in post-war countries like Liberia, where their, again, citizenship practices as well as their development practices are viscerally contested. So I'll demonstrate a chapter that actually shows this sort of notion that diasporas both help and hinder post-war development. And the chapter is entitled The Dichotomy of Diasporic Developmentalism. So in this chapter, what I show is that public sector productivity was actually enhanced by the number of Liberians who came back during the post-war moment in 2006, 2007, up until present. But there were a number of those returnees who got their hands caught in the cookie jar, that there were vast numbers of cases of post-war profiteering, particularly corrupt forms of post-war profiteering by some returnees who returned, which created this sort of backlash against dual citizenship. And I coined a term throughout the book called diasporas. And this is a term that I attribute primarily to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Liberia's first female elected president, but also the first woman elected head of state of Africa, in which there's a sort of outsized influence in her administration of 12 years of diasporas and returnees in the management of the affairs of the homeland state, which again creates a sort of backlash against dual citizenship. And many of these returnees were actually handsomely rewarded for their post-war public sector productivity. So I pulled a quote from a number of interviews that I conducted with policymakers, and one of those policymakers was Senator Cletus Watterson, who was the chief sponsor of the dual citizenship bill, but he also recognized the limitations of this diasporas as having an adverse impact on the bill that he sponsored. And he says, what didn't help the passage of dual citizenship much was that when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf got in power, most of the people that were coming to work for government were from the diaspora, and which was not to the liking of those that were here at home in Liberia. And their jobs were being given to only diasporans. Diasporans were preferred, and that didn't work too well, and the results have not been too good. So I'll move on to talk about what I believe are my theoretical contributions. The first is I employ as well as expand Norman Long's notion of actor-oriented analysis. And what Norman Long argued is that different actors respond to development interventions, such as the dual citizenship bill, for instance, in the case of Liberia, quite differently, again, based on their social locations as well as their life worlds. But it's not right to assume that those actors who might seemingly be quite subordinate or marginalized, that they don't have the agency or the capacity to act. So what I show throughout the book is that diasporas had just as much influence on the introduction of the bill as those at home had on the suspension of the bill. And he said these negotiations over development interventions, like a dual citizenship bill, for instance, occur at the interface. And at the interface is a site of both divergence, where there's a confrontation or conflict, for instance, the impasse on dual citizenship. But there can also be convergence, where different actors accommodate each other's different social locations or lived experiences. And there's actually agreement over a particular development intervention. But what I do throughout the book is I further this notion of the interface by moving beyond sort of bounded encounters over actual development interventions, so development projects, as it were, to a discussion of a more transnational ideological exchange over the pros as well as the cons of a proposed policy-oriented development intervention, such as dual citizenship in the case of Liberia. In terms of my other theoretical contributions, so what I do is I theorize citizenship as a triad. There are a number of scholars like Lisa Malky who demonstrate that identities, practices, and relations between people actually change in the aftermath of armed conflict. Now, Liberia had contested state formation processes from the 19th century, which eventually led to political upheavals in the 1980s, and then an all-out protracted armed conflict between 1989 and 2003. So this Liberian citizenship tree has three nodes. The first is identity, which is a passive form of citizenship. It really requires no action at all. There's a second node, which I theorize citizenship as practice. So it's a largely active form of citizenship. So it's everything, it's what you do with that identity that makes you a citizen. Do you pay taxes? Do you engage in building Liberian capacities? Do you engage in the political process? That's what makes you a citizen. There's a policymaker who talked about the practice sort of active form of citizenship as about contributing time, talent, and treasure. And then the third node of the citizenship triad is a sort of set of relations. So this is an interactive node of the citizenship triad in which we think about citizen-citizen interactions, but also citizen-government interactions. I also theorize citizenship as a political economy of belonging. So moving beyond the whole idea of the politics of belonging to the political economy of belonging. And this is a notion in which socioeconomic transformation really depends on the sort of provision of privileges and protections, what we might deem as rights, in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and obligations, what we might think of as responsibility. So this is a very transactional system between the rights and the responsibilities. And then lastly, I theorize citizenship from the perspective of a post-war African country of emigration, thereby expanding the contours of the general citizenship studies literature, which I believe tends to be incredibly Eurocentric and abstract. Now, what are my methodological and empirical contributions? So this book is based on multi-sided fieldwork, which I alluded to earlier. It's based on over 200 in-depth interviews that I conducted primarily with Liberian actors in the capitals of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And this is largely to test out a hypothesis that Saskia Saskin put forward in her book, The Global City, in which she argues that citizenship is most contested in capital cities. So this book has extensive comparative analysis where I look at the perspectives and experiences of what I call homelanders, so those domestically rooted Liberians, in contrast to the returnees, those who may have come back during the process of armed conflict or after armed conflict for conditional reasons, but also on a more permanent basis. I also compare and contrast the experiences of executive policymakers who were in charge in the president's cabinet of pushing post-war reconstruction and development dividends with legislative policymakers who were in charge of pushing forward particular legislative bills, such as the dual citizenship bill. So I talked earlier about how I interviewed the 4 sponsors of the bill, including Senator Cletus Watterson. And then last but certainly not least, I compare and contrast the perspectives of what Nicholas Van Heer calls the near diasporas. So those Liberians who live in the sub-region, like Liberians based in Sierra Leone as well as Ghana, as well as those in the United Kingdom and the United States. It looks like David Martin is trying to enter the room. If someone could let him in, that would be wonderful. So near and wider diasporas. And the reason I do this is because I really wanted to take on a sub-national perspective. Quite often in the literature on diasporas and development, there tends to be an overemphasis on diasporas who have gone further afield outside of their regions of origin, when in actuality, the vast majority of migrants or diasporas live in their regions of origin. So in the case of Liberians in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, for instance. So what I do is I employ vignettes, lots of verbatim quotes and vignettes that are taken generously from the fieldwork that I conducted. On the bottom, you see a table, which is a breakdown of the 202 Liberian respondents that I interviewed, the urban centers that they represented, where they lived, and then the sort of analytical categories that they fell within, within my analysis. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a bit about the implications for policymaking and practice in part 2. Now you see a table that I was able to generate from the 202 Liberians I interviewed to get a sense of what their position on dual citizenship is. Do they support dual citizenship? Do they support dual citizenship with reservations? Do they reject dual citizenship outright, or they're a bit more ambivalent about dual citizenship? There were a few respondents I wasn't able to record these particular perspectives on because we ran out of time during the interviews. But what's particularly interesting for me is that the vast majority of those I interviewed in my respondent pool were actually quite supportive of dual citizenship. About 61% of them were supportive of dual citizenship. Now, I make no claims throughout this book that my descriptive analytical statistics are in any way, shape, or form representative of Liberians worldwide. This study is largely exploratory, but there's some interesting trends that I was able to observe from these interviews. What's interesting primarily for me is those who rejected dual citizenship were primarily based in Monrovia, and they were largely homelanders. So Liberians who either left Liberia for very short periods of time or didn't leave the country during the armed conflict at all, had very visceral anti-dual citizenship positions. And you can see about 18% of my respondent pool were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. What's interesting about this particular descriptive statistic is that it's corroborated by Afrobarometer survey data. For those of you who are not familiar with the Afrobarometer survey, it's a Pan-African survey that looks at political trends within the continent of Africa. So an Afrobarometer survey was conducted in Liberia in 2012 as well as 2018, in which 2/3 of those surveyed in the country in those 2 years actually rejected dual citizenship outright. So you see a sort of corroboration in the research that I conducted with these Liberians that I interviewed. Now, Liberia had a national referendum in 2020, in December 2020. I see someone's trying to enter the room, so if we could please let them enter, that'd be great. So this national referendum took place in December 2020, in which dual citizenship was one of 8 propositions that were put forward. Now, the referendum overall was not a success. None of the propositions put forward were able to garner the 2/3 majority vote required to pass these particular constitutional changes. However, what I noticed is that the referendum results, especially as it relates to the proposition on dual citizenship, actually shows signs that Liberia is probably inching closer and closer to a sort of inevitable passage of dual citizenship, in which the continental trends in Africa are becoming more and more evident in the country. Even in counties, even in the sub-political divisions in Liberia, where dual citizenship was outright rejected. So places like Montserrado, where the capital city, Liberia, is located. There is a screenshot that I took of the National Elections Commission results, in which you see the vast majority of the valid ballots, right? There were a lot of invalid ballots, and we can talk about that during the Q&A if people are curious. But out of the valid ballots, you see about 96,000 of those in Montserrado County, where the capital Monrovia resides, against about 97,000 people who were staunchly against dual citizenship. So there's almost an even 50-50 split, whereas with the Afrobarometer survey data, again, 2/3 of those in 2012 and 2018 who were surveyed rejected dual citizenship. So in the space of about a couple of years, you see Liberians becoming more and more attuned to the fact that dual citizenship, again, may be a development enabler as opposed to a development spoiler. So there are about 5 counties, 5 subpolitical divisions, as I mentioned earlier, that rejected dual citizenship outright, but the other 10 supported dual citizenship. Not enough to get the 2/3 majority, but again, for me, this says something in terms of what policymaking might look like in the future. So I've got a couple more slides and then I'll end. However, there's always a but. What I argue throughout the book is that Liberia has to take a gradual, phased approach towards dual citizenship, given its history of migration, conflict, and post-war recovery. But more importantly, given that people in the country still have, I would say, legitimate misgivings about the passage of a dual citizenship bill. One of the recommendations that I make is that Liberia has to reconcile the contradictions between the Aliens and Nationality Law, which was passed in 1973, which explicitly prohibits dual citizenship, and the 1986 Constitution, which is seemingly more permissive. Liberia also has to think about how do you reform the judiciary, because during my interviews, particularly with domestic Liberians, there were concerns that Liberians tend to flout national laws, specifically those who live abroad, right? So looking at the rule of law, how do we institute laws that are enforced to ensure that if dual citizenship is passed, that people cannot evade the law? And then lastly, addressing inequalities. Liberia is one of the most unequal countries on the continent of Africa. So inequalities around income, inequalities around land access, and inequalities around transitional justice. So there is a large lobby in Liberia at the moment to push for the establishment of a war and economic crimes court, given that there were egregious economic as well as physical violence crimes that were committed during the armed conflict. So ultimately what I'm saying is that in order for dual citizenship to be passed, Liberia has to think very strategically about how do we extend rights while also extracting responsibilities from would-be dual citizens. And there are actually quite a number of examples from the continent of Africa of these sort of mediation kind of tools that states have used. So for instance, Eritrea has a 2% diaspora tax that it charges. And that money, that revenue is used for everything from building roads to strengthening healthcare systems. Now, many people will argue that Eritrea is probably not the best example, given that it has a very repressive state. But we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are a lot of countries in the continent of Africa that are doing incredibly interesting things as it relates to harnessing the potential of those abroad. Why not take some of those policy initiatives and insert it in Liberia's own policy around dual citizenship? So for instance, Senegal allows the voting for diaspora representative in the national legislature. So could Liberia institute this in lieu of enabling Liberians abroad or those who have citizenships outside of Liberia to vote in national elections or even to hold political office? Sierra Leone has an operational office of diaspora affairs in the presidency. When I worked for the Liberian government, I tried to institute something very similar. And then Ethiopia, one of the countries that does not, or that actually prohibits dual citizenship, allows non-citizen diasporas to invest, to own shares and set up lending businesses in the country. Could Liberia do something similar as a stopgap measure before a full-out dual citizenship bill is instituted? And then last but certainly not least, could diasporas be granted the right to purchase rural land in exchange for agricultural production, given that there are large numbers of empty hectares of land just laying fallow in Liberia that are not being used properly? Now, there might be concerns in terms of this particular policy intervention that in the past, Liberia's had large agro-industrial ventures spearheaded by multinationals that are not actually given back to domestic population. So that might be a concern, but there are ways to go around that. So I'll end there by saying that if you want to purchase the book, there's purchase information. You can actually download the introduction for free at that particular website. And if you want to order the hardback that's available now or the ebook, you can go to the second website and enter the promo code Pailey, all caps 2020 or Pailey 20 at checkout for a 20% discount. So I hope I haven't gone over my time, but thank you for your attention. And I believe the questions and comments will follow after the discussants.
Great, thank you so much, Robtel. You've done a masterful job of squeezing quite a lot of information in a really rich book into just a few minutes. I allowed you to run over just because we started late, so you kept to time in terms of your allotted time. Don't worry about it. We're going to move right into comments from Thabani, Mutambasere, and if you missed the beginning part of my comments, then what I said was we're going to hear from two commentaries, and then Robtel will respond. We'll hear from two more, short response, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So Thabani, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Laura. So in the interest of saving time, I actually wrote myself a script so that I don't go over. So hopefully that is useful. So I'm basically going to speak in relation to my own work on citizenship and the diaspora using the case of Zimbabweans in the UK. I'll start by saying, this was to be a very fascinating and exciting book, which is a great contribution to the scholarship on citizenship, development, and migration, which is, was a pleasure to read. Learning about the story of the history of the Liberian state was quite fascinating for me because I'd never really engaged with that particular literature, and the way the book traces the history in a way that is easy to follow is quite fantastic. The vignettes that you actually referred to just now sort of added a very, very interesting dimension, and your own personal experience that you included in the book to me sort of helps contextualize everything And it makes clear some of the complexities or hybrid categories of citizenship that you discuss in the case of Liberia. I also interestingly noted that at the beginning, the book starts out by talking about how citizenship has been tangentially mentioned in the literature of the Liberian state. And I found that quite intriguing based on the account that follows regarding dual citizenship, the tensions between homelanders and diasporans. The usage of Long's actor-oriented analysis framework sort of worked well to show, as you put it, that actors responded or respond to development-oriented policy prescriptions and interventions based on their life worlds or lived experiences and social locations of socio-economic positions. Related to that, also, the argument that citizenship is also about practices and interactions embodied in these life worlds and social locations of actors in Liberia and across transnational spaces is one that I actually agree with. And in my own case, in my own research, it is indeed true for the Zimbabwean diaspora. So among Zimbabweans, I argue that, because the Zimbabwean diaspora is denied dual citizenship, was denied dual citizenship until the new constitution, but that is yet to be also aligned with the law. They practice diasporic citizenship through active practices of engagement and transnational belonging to the homeland, which is not necessarily bound by legal parameters, and it transcends these legal frameworks. This, in my opinion, also includes or allows us to include so-called irregular migrants or irregular members of the diaspora. I can also draw similarities and contrasts from my own work, particularly on struggles over Liberian citizenship and how those impacted development policy and practice within the country. So among Zimbabweans, I found that struggles over citizenship by the diaspora also contributed to political development, as these diaspora members are involved in various transnational civic and political engagements with the home country, sort of seeking, in a way, to request their own rights, so the diaspora vote, for example, but also contributing to other aspects of democracy and governance, particularly opening up civic spaces through working with social movements and the like. And as I was reading each and every chapter, I kept thinking in the back of my mind how I wish the book had been published before I finalized my PhD thesis, as there was a lot that I could have drawn from. The book seems to draw from similar notions I also base my work on, particularly moving away from narrow legal understandings of citizenship that do not adequately account for multi-layeredness of social identity. The issue of dual citizenship is one that is also quite contentious in the case of Zimbabwe. And I think there is a reference to that in the book itself. And just like in the case of Liberia, I also found that, to borrow again your phrasing, homelander Zimbabweans were not always supportive of extending rights to Zimbabweans abroad. Though this was not the main focus of my research, I was trying to examine the impact of these transnational civic and political engagements and what those at home think about them. So they too were quite suspicious of the diaspora and argued that if you have left the country, that is it. You've left, you've gone, leave us with our troubles, some people actually said. They additionally relayed the struggles for everyday life in Zimbabwe versus the comforts of living in the UK, for example. Obviously with the, sometimes misguided assumption that, if you leave the country, if you are in the UK, life is perfect for you. So they say one cannot have both. But on the other hand, diasporans argued that they should not be punished for seeking to protect their families through immigrating, which is somewhat a recurring theme throughout the book. Connected to that is also the fact that homelanders make these arguments despite benefiting from large amounts of investment and remittances from the country's diaspora. So unlike in the case of Liberia, the Zimbabwean government still looks at diasporans with a curious and suspicious eye, obviously linked with the idea of regime change, as the government puts it. And the late former President Robert Mugabe actually famously labeled them traitors who had left the comfort of their lives in Zimbabwe to go, and I quote, scrub the backs of old white British people, referring to the Zimbabweans working in the care sector in the UK. Furthermore, you talk about the extension of the transatlantic surveillance system, based at the Liberian embassies around the world, particularly I think in the UK. And this was also the case in my own experience with Zimbabweans, that the embassy was very much linked with surveillance. It was made worse by knowledge that Zimbabweans, when they were arriving post-crisis in the early 2000s, so too were intelligence operatives masquerading as asylum seekers and everyday diasporans or Zimbabweans. There are also strong calls within the case of Zimbabwe, just like in Liberia, for dual citizenship amongst Zimbabweans diasporans. And the diasporans themselves argue that the transnational engagements that they have with the country through proxy organizations is one of the contributions that they're making. So in addition to remittances and the like, they make all these other contributions. But as I was saying earlier, this is not always understood the same by those at home. And Zimbabwe followed a similar policy to Liberia for a while, where one had to renounce their citizenship if they gained citizenship of another country. This period was quite terrible for quite a lot of people, and there were cases that I came across whilst doing my fieldwork, where embassies, Zimbabwean embassies around the world, would sometimes refuse to authorize repatriation of bodies of Zimbabweans who had passed away after serving in other countries' militaries. And your observation that most African post-independent citizenship laws represent colonial artifacts that exclude rather than embrace multiple forms of legal national identity is one that resonates quite well with my own work, and I absolutely agree. I also found interesting arguments about President Sirleaf's misguided trust in returnees, and the very interesting term that you were just talking about of diaspocracy, and how it simultaneously helped and hindered recovery, thus influencing claims for and against dual citizenship. I thought this was an interesting concept, and I can see how it can play out in many different contexts in Africa. So sort of trying to apply that in other cases. So for example, it is something that I foresee happening in Zimbabwe if there were to be a change of government at some point. We've already seen glimpses of this when the opposition party formations were part of the government of national unity, and a few individuals returned to Zimbabwe to work, advise, and offer their expertise to the main opposition parties. And I also found in the book stories about diasporans carrying both Liberian and country of settlement passports, something my respondents also shared with me. And in my own work, I argue that this is actually part of what ISIN calls acts of citizenship, as they defied the previous citizenship law that required one to renounce the Zimbabwean citizenship on acquiring that of the country of settlement. And I also found interesting the link that there were instances where there were very high reverse remittances in the Liberian case. I think one of your respondents even argued that they were the remitter, and how that is connected to the issue of capital flight. Based on some of these observations, I could see how returnees can pose a threat to homelanders themselves. So all in all, I think this is a very, very fascinating book, as I've already mentioned, which makes a strong contribution towards the citizenship studies as well as migration and development literature. So I'll close off with a few questions that came to mind as I was reading the book. Some of them you've already addressed in the book itself, but just wondering if you can elaborate a bit more. And there are quite a few, so feel free to ignore some of them. So in your opinion, basically researching citizenship on the African context and given the Liberia situation, how can African states create a more egalitarian and inclusive form of citizenship, which in some instances is not based on race and ethnicity? Is this something that is a possibility? How do we, to borrow from the book, challenge or unsettle the foundations of citizenship based on a liberal white state, but also remain inclusive? And what is the way forward for citizenship in a post-colonial era? And just to add to that as well, do you think a Pan-African citizenship is somehow achievable? And secondly, out of curiosity, there is a discussion about the tensions between Liberians in Sierra Leone and Sierra Leoneans. And I was just wondering if there were reverse migration flows from Sierra Leone to Liberia, and if so, whether there are similar attitudes towards Sierra Leonean migrants in Liberia. And one of the book's major critiques is President Sirleaf's focus on state building at the expense of national building or nation building, and how this affected the dual citizenship question. So based on this, how can governments create a balance whilst rebuilding? So how can they also engage diasporas in a way that encourages citizen engagement on the part of homelanders too? And finally, the book sort of argues how some returnees were out of touch with domestic realities and not fully equipped to lead recovery efforts, something we find in many different instances in Africa, in Latin America, and the like. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about what it means for diaspora engagement. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thabani. You've given us some good questions to start off our discussion with when we get to that part. I'll turn quickly to Kirstie Kwarteng. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Robtel, for inviting me to speak on this panel. I don't know if you remember, but when I was applying to SOAS, Robtel, she read over my PhD application. So I'm really honored that she asked me to come and speak about her book, which I really, really, really enjoyed. I think it really thoroughly explained an issue that's very complex and multi-layered, but it explained it very thoroughly. And I also really appreciated how you situate the current citizenship situation in Liberia in its historical and socio-cultural context, going as far back as the American Colonization Society and King Peter, which this is informative for me from a historical perspective as well, because I didn't know any of that. So thank you for including that in your book. And my work is focused on the transnational experiences of second-generation Ghanaians. I myself am a second-generation Ghanaian, and I think that this work also makes really great contributions to the areas of development studies, migration studies, and of course diaspora. And as someone that is researching an African diaspora group, I will always appreciate more literature that's done on African diaspora populations, especially literature that is written by someone from those communities, which I think we need more of. One of the things that I appreciated a lot of things about this book, but one of the things I appreciated was how the book reminds us to conceptualize diaspora beyond the Western experience. Because a lot of work that's done on state-linked African diasporas tend to focus on those who are in the Western diaspora communities. And not to say that we shouldn't, examine those experiences, but more often than not, the largest diaspora populations for African countries are in somewhere else on the African continent. And I know when I was selecting field sites for my dissertation, my advisor, who is Laura, who's sharing this discussion, she kind of reminded me to include Ghana or include Accra as one of the field sites, because there is a tendency in diaspora work to talk around the country of origin without engaging it directly. And I'm really glad that I was able to include Accra as one of my field sites. And then this book does a really excellent job of incorporating perspectives from the near diasporas on the African continent, the wider diasporas in the West, as well as the perspectives of the homelanders, people that haven't really left Liberia. And in doing that, we really get to see a full global perspective about how Liberians across the world conceptualize citizenship, identity, and belonging. I feel that the book also, reminds us that diasporas are not static populations. A lot of times there's kind of this idea that when people, leave their country of origin and they go somewhere else, they just stay in that place. But as we saw with some of the people that you spoke with, that's not always the case. There were people in in London and DC or in other places that had gone through 1, 2, 3, like they traveled through a few countries before they got to their final destination, and they stayed in those countries for various amounts of time. And additionally, like when they settle in these countries permanently, there's still cross-border movement that's happening, because they'll be going back and forth to Liberia, or they'll be visiting friends and family in other places, or they might even be moving within their country of settlement, internally as well. So I think it's important to remember that, that diasporas we're always moving. Diasporas are not static. And I also, regarding how you broke down, like you created a difference between the circular returnees and permanent returnees. And this is something that I think I will be able to use in my research as I'm still writing my dissertation. And because in my work with second generation Ghanaians, I've seen similar migration patterns. There's now, because of, the year of return, and there's been Ghana's doing a lot of things to bring people, home. And there's now been an increase in what people are calling roots migration, where people, the descendants of immigrants are returning to their ancestral homelands to live and to create tangible, connections with the country. And so because of that, you have second gen Ghanaians who are maybe going to Ghana for 3 or 4 weeks, 2 to 3 times a year, or maybe they're staying in Ghana 3 to 6 months out of the year, and they're in wherever in their country of birth the rest of the time. Then you also have second gens who have sold all of their possessions and belongings and have permanently relocated to Ghana. So I really it was good to see the difference in that not all returnees are the same. There's differences in the returnee experience, and with that, the book also shows that the diaspora experiences are not monolithic. They are very diverse, and people's experience within their diaspora community will be impacted by a variety of factors, like their legal citizenship status, their social class, ethnic group, education levels, where they were born. So there are a lot of things that influence and impact one's experience within their diaspora community, and that will in turn impact how they view things like citizenship, identity, home, and belonging. Now, I think one of my favorite takeaways from this book is how it reframed citizenship, and I felt that the book was trying to move citizenship beyond solely being a legal status. And I think it's in the second chapter where you're talking about citizenship in the Liberian context being on a continuum, with active citizenship paired with practice on one end, identity or passive citizenship paired with identity at the other. And I argue that putting it on that continuum kind of makes it fluid, and that gives it gives more people the opportunity to engage in citizenship in a variety of ways that can either be individual or collective, as you say, or local and transnational. And that makes it easier for people to participate in the political economy of belonging. However, as the book shows, that not all citizenship practices are viewed equally. Everything is pretty much contested, more or less. And so just because you feel like you're picking this citizenship practice to show, like, yes, I am Liberian, or I am Ghanaian, or I am engaging in my country in this way, and it's not everybody that will support you in that. And I remember the example of someone saying that they're sending remittances, they're in the diaspora sending remittances to support their family back home, and in doing that, trying to prove that by supporting people in Liberia, they are supporting the nation state of Liberia as a whole. But other people didn't really buy that. I remember someone saying, like, well, of course, you're not going to let your mother starve. So to them, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for them to send remittances to their family, because of course you were going to send remittances to your family, but they felt that there needed to be more. There's something a bit more tangible for Liberia as a whole. So even though that the practices may be contested, I think putting citizenship on a continuum, it shows that it's not something that is only had in a legal sense. It's something that can be performed. And I feel that in my work with second generation Ghanaians, in my study, only a handful of them actually had dual citizenship, although it is something that Ghana has dual citizenship. In the book you wrote about it, I think since it came about in the mid 90s, but wasn't enacted until the early 2000s. And so now we'll probably see an increase of second generation and subsequent generation Ghanaians getting dual citizenship. But in my study at the time, only a handful of the participants had dual Ghanaian and UK or US citizenship. Some had like American and German citizenship, some were Italian. But even with that, people were still engaging in what you would call citizenship practices, either through relocating or maintaining some type of transnational connection with Ghana or people in Ghana, or doing things locally within their local diaspora communities through their religious institutions or through political action. So I know I want to be mindful of time. So I only have one question for you. And I was curious because when we talk about migration or Black migration to the US, not discussing slavery or the transatlantic slave trade, we talk from the African perspective, or at least rather from the Ghanaian perspective. We really see migration outside of the African continent to the UK, Canada, US happening around the 70s and 80s. But there was a vignette where someone said that they were a child to Liberian immigrants who were studying in the 1960s. And I was like, wow, that sounds very early. And it seemed like that person's parents were quite settled in the United States. So I was wondering, when did migration to the US from Liberia really, where people went and kind of and stayed? When did that happen? When did that begin? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Robtel, you've got a few minutes to respond, and you don't necessarily have to respond to all of the questions in this bit. We could come back to some of them as well, but I am going to keep you to 4 minutes in response, and then we'll hear from the others, and we can come back to whatever you haven't been able to cover later on. So go ahead.
Sure. So I think what I'll do is, if it's okay with Thabani and Kirstie, thank you so much for your reflections. It's always useful for me to hear case studies from other contexts, because I think that's what creates a really rich pool of data to then theorize from, because I think we need to do more of that sort of grounded theorizing from the continent of Africa. And the more examples we have from Zimbabwe and the more examples we have from Ghana, the better we are equipped to do that kind of theorizing. So what I'll do is I'll answer Kirstie's question, then I'll answer one question from Thabani, and then we can go on to Sibongile and Natasha, and then we'll come back to all the other questions, if that's all right with the two of you. Yeah? Okay, so I'll start with Kirstie's question, because I think it's pretty easy to in terms of answering. When did migration from Liberia to the US really, really begin, where people were actually settling in the United States? I would say after the 1980 coup, that effectively overthrew settler domination. Now it's difficult to kind of do a précis of that history, because people should read the book and then you get a more textured analysis of the history. But effectively, Liberia was ruled by descendants of Black settlers from the establishment of the nation state in 1847 until about 1980, when an indigenous master sergeant by the name of Samuel Kanyando, there were whispers and rumors about the fact that he was supported by the CIA, but he overthrew that settler hegemony. In 1980, many of those descendants of settlers who were part of the ruling elite fled, fearing reprisals from Doe and his administration. So those are the ones who went to places like Cote d'Ivoire and settled in Cote d'Ivoire. So someone like an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was one of those people who left. And many of her cabinet officials who came back in the mid 2000s left and settled in parts of West Africa. But a lot of Liberians who had the wherewithal to go further afield to the United States, to the UK, to other parts of the so-called global North did, and then ended up settling there. So I would say it was that 1980 coup that created the more entrenched transnational Liberian identity. Much more than before, because before people were just going for very short periods of time. They went to study, they went to engage in business practices, but always always return to Liberia. Much of this is from the oral history, but a lot of it is also documented as well. So I hope that answers your question, Kirstie. Yeah? Okay, Thabani, I'll go with, is a Pan-African citizenship possible? I think it is. And what's interesting is that you almost see the African Union trying to play a mediation role in creating this sort of Pan-African citizenship. So for instance, the African Union has 5 regions based on the continent, but they also have a 6th region, which is the diaspora, right? You also have countries like the, institutions, Pan-African institutions like the African Development Bank pushing for countries in the continent to liberalize their visa regimes, to liberalize their citizenship regimes, such that our citizenship laws are not, do not stop us from having 2 African citizenships, right? Opening up borders so that you've got the African Continental Free Trade Area that's also accompanied with the Free Movement of Persons Protocol at the continental level. So I would say these are sort of overtures to a more Pan-African identity, a more Pan-African citizenship that we saw quite like conspicuously in the 1960s and the 1970s. You've also got the African Union's Agenda 2063, which is trying to say, we're all part of this sort of, continental movement to ensure that the continent transforms, and we can't do that without Africans abroad. So, I think we're inching closer and closer to that, in the same way that a Zimbabwe or Liberia is inching closer and closer to having full out, clearly defined provisions on dual citizenship. I would say the more and more we push towards that, in terms of ensuring all the countries on the continent have more liberalized visa regimes or liberalized citizenship regimes, the closer and closer we get to a Pan-African citizenship. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We are now going to hear from our final 2 kind of commentators. So let me introduce both of them first. Natasha Dyer Williams is a research, communications, and partnership consultant in international development, working across Africa for over a decade. She is studying for an interdisciplinary PhD in international development at the University of Edinburgh, exploring migrant women's navigation of xenophobia and belonging in Johannesburg and London, using mixed qualitative methods and an intersectional lens. And then finally, we'll hear from Sibongile Zulu, who is a first-year DPhil candidate in international development at the University of Oxford. She has an MPhil in African Studies from the University of Cambridge and a BA in Politics and International Relations from Queen Mary University, London. Her work centers on the impact of Bantustanization on the enactment of gendered citizenship in post-apartheid South Africa, and she's supervised by Professor Lauren Landau. So, Natasha, do you want to start us off?
Great, thank you so much to Laura for the introduction and to Robtel for the invitation to join this panel with distinguished academics and colleagues. It's a real honor to be here, especially as the only non-African respondent in African Studies and International Development. I'm very honored and delighted, so thank you. So yeah, just briefly, I want to make some comments about the book, Robtel, and then speak a little bit also from perspectives that I have engaging with primarily, but not only, African women in both Johannesburg and London, some of whom are first generation, but also second and third generation. So yeah, I loved reading this book. It gave me a lot to think about in terms of my own work, but also, as the others have said, a real education in Liberia that I found fascinating. A lot of things I didn't know, and it's only kind of inspired me to read more. So thank you so much for really doing a thorough job, and historically, but as well as contemporary perspectives and culturally and so on. I particularly love the use of your vignettes and bringing the voices of your respondents to the fore, and the personal testimonies, which is something that I think is often lacking in academic literature, and I think you have to search quite hard to find them. So I really like that you brought these testimonies really front and center to your work, but also combined them with your own positionality reflections, which I found really valuable, because again, I always appreciate when researchers and academics put their own positionality concerns sort of up front and center. I try and do that myself as a grandchild of migrants from former Czechoslovakia. I'm also of migrant extraction, but I used to live in South Africa, and obviously I'm from the UK. But I think it's important to kind of, own where we come from and why we have certain reflections, as well as where we're situated in relation to our respondents and our participants. So thank you so much for doing that. That was fantastic. One of the things that I was really interested in was, because you talk a lot about the diasporic actors and the domestic actors, and obviously you can't do everything in one book. But what I really was interested in was perhaps in the future a further disaggregation of these groups, because of course you do go into it in your book, but from conversations I've had with colleagues and others, they're obviously not homogenous groups. So a colleague of mine who's from Nigeria, but actually has done work in Liberia, was talking about the bean twos, which you will know of people who have been somewhere else from Liberia. That's what they're known as, apparently, and how they, their kind of interactions with those who stayed. But again, I wanted to know maybe perhaps about those who are not always engaged in politics or patriotism. Of course, there are many both diasporic and domestic actors, I imagine, who don't necessarily feel strongly one way or the other, or who are a bit more disengaged. And as I said, I understand you can't reach everyone in this book, but that was something I was really interested in learning more about, and especially because in my own work, I try not to homogenize, migrant women or African women or women or men from a particular country, because of course you can't really do that while also obviously drawing conclusions. So I think it's a really difficult balance to strike, but I just, in your future work, I'd love to learn more about that. Oh yeah, just and on that note, as I think Kirstie was saying about the multiple positions of migrants moving through space and time and having very different kind of journeys in different places, I thought of Kirstie Mahendran's migration mobility continuum, where she basically interviews people and creates like a 10 perspective continuum of positions of integration, basically, that adopt these different positions along her continuum of migration and mobility that don't fit into the neat categories basically espoused by the European Union and others. And I just thought it'd be something maybe to look at, because I've certainly found it instructive in my work, or at least helpful to try and, you're trying to categorize people but not pigeonhole them. And I think that's what you're trying to do. So that's something that came to mind that might be useful. I also wanted to just mention something which I thought was really interesting, which is that a lot of the discursive reflections and the dialogues kind of talked about, this idea that the rights and responsibilities of the diasporic actors, and some domestic actors did recognize the difficulties that those who left may have faced. But what I didn't see as much of, which I think is perfectly interesting for my work, is the challenges that diasporic actors inevitably faced when going to a new country and dealing with the immigration policies and structures in those countries, and why you even mentioned your own mother naturalized to help you in your education and studies. And so, those who, of course, there are multiple reasons why they would naturalize or why they would leave. But I think, again, just a recognition that many governments or countries, it's not like people arrive and have this wonderful experience and then have dual citizenship and they just have loads of opportunities. Sometimes they're facing anti-migrant, xenophobic government policies, such as in the UK, or one might argue in South Africa, where I'm doing my research. And so I think that was just something that I was interested in, that perhaps there's not adequate knowledge of that, or there's perhaps perceptions that people kind of leave and then, I don't know, reach some kind of promised land, but actually a lot of their experiences are very difficult. So that was just something that came to mind. And another thing I wanted to ask you, which is I'm sure you'll come across in your conversations, but given Liberia's relatively unique history of settlement, independence, conflict, migration, and post-war reconstruction that you set out so brilliantly in the book, do you think that makes the battle over, or this tussle over dual citizenship in any way unique, or not? And the reason I mention that is because, as many people will know, especially Sibongile will know this, in South Africa, South Africans tend to think, because of the history of apartheid, that their history is totally unique, which it is in many ways, but that it therefore means that their situation now is very unique. And what I found is to be actually not the case necessarily, that yes, it is unique in many ways, but there are many parallels with other countries about the situation that migrants and South Africans are facing in terms of citizenship and belonging. So that, you know, I draw between the UK and South Africa, but many others draw from other places as well. So it's a kind of this sense of, is it Liberia has this kind of uniqueness to this debate, or not, in your view? Yes, and the final point, that's it. I just had a final point I wanted to make, which is a slightly less substantive comment, but I just wanted to appreciate your use of alliteration, because I don't know whether, as a communications person, I really enjoyed this. And I just wanted to highlight 3 that you did, which I really liked, which is that you said in your introduction that the book deploys the dual citizenship mechanism to evaluate the country's long-standing attempts at constructing a unique brand of citizenship that is totalizing, tactical, and timeless. So that was very good. You had a chapter called Birthplace, Bloodline, Blackness, and Beyond, and one also in chapter 2, I think, about time, talent, and treasure. So those I thought were great. I just wanted to mention them because I always appreciate communication creativity. And the final point I wanted to just make was that this sense of, because in my own work, I look at belonging a lot, and I find it fascinating because it does encompass, as you rightly point out, not just legal factors and cultural factors, but so much around identity and really the core of people's feeling about themselves. And there are so many works on this, but I just was particularly thinking of The Perils of Belonging by Peter Gashira, who looks at sort of autochthony and citizenship and exclusion in Africa and Europe, and kind of tracing that, you know, what is belonging born from the soil, as autochthony is defined as, or, you know, does it, as I think most of us would agree, encompass many different things, because people have these multiple experiences and identities. That means they belong to different places in different times in different ways. And so how can you say that you are fully Liberian or fully, you know, British or one or the other, or, you know, is that kind of impossible in a sense? You know, yes, we are a globalized world, but people also hold on very strongly to their own local cultural national ties. So it's just a kind of comment really about, to open up to everyone about, you know, how do we define this concept of belonging in a world that is globalized, yes, but also incredibly fractured along identity-based lines. So then I'll end there. Thank you so much, Robtel. It was a pleasure to read your book.
Thanks so much, Natasha. And now, Sibongile, would you like to wrap us up here?
Yes, first I just want to say thank you to Robtel for not only inviting me to this panel with these distinguished people, but also for the monograph. It's literally just a formidable contribution to the literature, not only of like critical citizenship, African studies, politics, development, and Liberian studies, as you've said, but it's also, as everyone has said before me, it is a delight to read, and it's also very poetic, which I enjoyed, so thank you. In terms of my reflections, I've sort of written them down as a series of questions, and I hope you don't mind again. So in the concluding chapter of the book, you take us through the Ebola epidemic, particularly on the collaborative efforts by domestic and diasporic Liberian actors to sort of allay the devastation that was caused by and the spread of the disease itself. You reflect on how this reconfigured and sort of ushered in a new political subjectivities and conceptualizations of citizenship in the country. I know it's still very early to tell, but I wonder if you see any similarities or differences with the COVID pandemic right now, and how that has sort of changed or influenced anything within conceptualizations and enacting ways of being a Liberian citizenship. You also mentioned the ways that the contemporary reconfigurations of Liberian citizenship transcend the legislative prescriptions and definitions which are enshrined in the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Act. You really bring forward how citizenship is it's no longer just embedded in traditional Marshallian understandings of it being maybe a civic obligation or something that is bestowed by a hegemonic state onto people, but it's something a bit more performative, and it entails processes and movements that people from below actually enact and constitute by themselves. So I just wondered if, I know you mentioned this in the book, but I wondered if you could perhaps talk a bit more about spatializing understandings of citizenship. So given that it's dynamic, it's very interactive, and it has a very active element to it alongside the passive element that you talk about. So could you speak a bit more about how this differs between peri-urban settings and rural settings, and perhaps within groups as well? So let's say between generations, between men and women, and vice versa. How are these boundaries constantly shifting? And then another question I had was essentially about the interviews that you conducted with the interlocutors. I just wondered if you noticed anything in the ways in which people spoke about and in the ways in which they memorialized citizenship from the pre-war years and then now within the contemporary period. And what do you think this says about how people tend to situate themselves within the context of very, very big domestic changes? And then also alongside with this, I wanted to know what you thought about the potential of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as being a foundation for structuring and reconfiguring Liberian citizenship. Is it worthwhile essentially to revisit the report and think about how do we continue with Liberian citizenship through there? And then finally, just a question tied in with the work that I'm doing. So as part of my DPhil project, I'm interested in questions understanding how is it that women who are residing in former Bantustan sort of render themselves as political, and what does political mean to them? How do they understand that? But how do they understand it? How do they understand it and make sense of it in contexts that are not tied to big political movements? So in the past, it was the anti-apartheid movement, and then now we have the Fees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall movement. So how is it that they render themselves political, perhaps within their daily lives? And I wanted to know, again, this is tied to the question of memorialization again. What did you notice about the ways in which your diasporic interlocutors and domestic interlocutors sort of render themselves political? And has that changed throughout the years? Yes, finally, thank you so much again. It was truly a delight to read, and I'm very excited to see more of your work in the future.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for your really thoughtful comments and for also sharing some of your own insights from your own research. I didn't start this session off by claiming it to be a session by and about early career researchers, because I hate that term, because I think that the work that you guys are doing is every bit as mature as what old people like me are doing. So probably more so, probably more carefully thought out. So I just find it really exciting to hear about all of this work that's in the making, and look forward to having more of it come out into the domain where we can all kind of engage with it more. So really great to hear about your different kinds of work. Robtel, do you want to first start off maybe by responding to some of these questions that have been posed to you, and then we'll just kind of roll that into some Q&A as going forward. I see I've put in a note in the chat asking people please to just throw your question into the chat if you like. I'll ask you then to unmute yourself and ask it yourself. So I'm not going to ask your question for you, but at least then I'll know kind of where we're going with the discussion. So that would be really helpful. I've also taken a note of a few of the questions that have been posed so far that we haven't got to, so we can go back to those too. Go ahead, Robtel.
Sure. Thank you so much, Natasha and Sibongile, for your reflections. I mean, what's great is, and you'll get to this point, all of you, when you put your monograph out into the public sphere, where you're not really sure how it will be received because this is your baby. It's something that you work on for a long period of time, and it's terrifying. But I will say that what's been incredibly gratifying and just affirming is hearing you say how much you enjoyed reading the book, because I think many academic books are quite boring. So I deliberately, because I think of myself as a storyteller. Natasha mentioned the whole idea of the alliteration. I mean, that's the kind of writing that I do. I think of myself as a storyteller in as much as I think of myself as a scholar. And to be able to meld the two, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way, but I think it's something we should strive to do. And so when I was writing this book, what I wanted to make sure is that my mom could read it and my dad could read it and people who I interviewed could read it and could understand, even though, you know, there are times when it becomes incredibly theoretical, but it makes sense and it's clear and it's intelligible and digestible. But I will say that I want to also give a shout out to Laura, because I don't know if you've read Laura's first monograph that was published with, was it Cornell University Press that you published? I got so much inspiration from Laura's anthropological study on emplacement amongst, I'm going to make sure that I don't mess this up, but Ethiopian migrants who were basically returning back to Ethiopia, but were placed in a different location from where they had lived before they left Ethiopia. Did I get that right, Laura?
Yeah. And
Okay.
now recently, in the last few months have been probably displaced again, unfortunately, but yes.
It was Laura's book that, reading Laura's book made me realize that this was possible, that I could write a book that was literary as much as it was scholarly. And so I want to just honor Laura for that, because had I not read that book, I probably wouldn't realize that it was possible. So yes, just wanting to say that you appreciate that and you recognize that I was being intentional about making sure that the book was enjoyable to read, in as much as it was interesting and analytical is really helpful. So what I'll do is I'll do the same thing I did with Thabani and Kirstie, is I'll answer one question from Natasha, one question from Sibongile, and maybe we can go to see if anyone in the audience has a question, then I'll go back to those. So let's start with Sibongile's question about the potential of the TRC. I think the TRC recommendations of the TRC reports, there were two versions of it. There was a version 1 and a version 2, and both of them together are incredibly comprehensive. But what I really appreciated about the TRC process in Liberia is that it recognized that we have to go back to the founding of the nation state, that this war didn't exist in a vacuum, that there were all these political upheavals that didn't turn out into all-out warfare, but were very, very much about the legacy and the history of inequality in Liberia. That is why we have the war, right? All these structural inequalities that we had not reconciled for over, almost 200 years. So I read that TRC report from cover to cover, both volumes. And what I appreciated about the report is that it said one of the reasons we had the war is the lack of recognition of voice, accountability, the lack of recognition that we are a migratory nation, but how do we reconcile those very different perspectives, whether it's a diasporic perspective or a domestic perspective, a settler perspective or an indigenous perspective. And yes, these are very fixed kind of binary notions of who Liberians are. But until we reconcile that notion of identity, who we are as a nation state, who we are as citizens and how we interact with one another, we will continue to have these sort of political upheavals. So I would say that the TRC for me was really an important starting point for thinking about issues of development practice, for thinking about issues of citizenship practice. And it's unfortunate that the recommendations were completely sidelined during the administration of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, because she was implicated as one of the major people responsible for the armed conflict of 1989 to 2003. But what's interesting now is that, as I mentioned during the presentation, there's a huge lobby for a war and economics crimes court. And many of my respondents, both those abroad as well as those in the country, talked about the fact that without justice, we can't move forward. And in the absence of that sort of transparency and accountability as it relates to war crimes, but then also not just the physical violence, but also the economic violence of the war, where people really profited like substantially from sort of, wartime as well as post-war economic livelihoods, that I would say we need to go back to the report. We need to talk about those recommendations. There were over 10, 12 of them. Only one of them was actually implemented in terms of setting up a National Human Rights Commission. But I would say the recommendations are really, really, the foundation of that is citizenship. It's about how do you interact with the nation state? How do you interact with other citizens? And how do we become accountable to each other, right? One of the policymakers during the interviews, I think the Justice Minister, Kirstie Natasha, said that one of the things that binds us as a people is our shared experiences, right? Shared experiences of the war, but also pre-war. So I would say, yes, I think the TRC process, the recommendations, and even the 21st century contemporary public discourse around justice, around an economic and war crimes court, I would say the foundation of that is really citizenship. So it opens up the scope for us to really have uncomfortable but honest conversations about where we're going, where we've come from, and what kinds of things we need to do in terms of policy making, in terms of accountability mechanisms to really solidify what it means to be a Liberian. Let's move to Natasha's question about, is this case study of Liberia very unique? I would say Liberia's history is very unique. The state formation process is very unique. But as Thabani has mentioned, as Kirstie has mentioned, as even you have mentioned, and Sibongile has mentioned, the experience of 21st century citizenship and the contestations therein are not unique. And so what I do is, you'll notice that one of the chapters where I focus on, dual citizenship and its discontents in Africa, that was my intention to talk about the fact that, yes, this history of state formation and the citizenship that came out of that state formation process is unique. However, if you think about the 21st century manifestations of citizenship in Liberia and the contestations around dual citizenship, there's actually nothing new under the sun that Liberia has not experienced, that Sierra Leone has not experienced, that Zimbabwe is not experiencing, Ghana, South Africa, other countries on the continent of Africa as well. So I would say it's the inception of the nation state and the formation thereof that's unique about Liberia, given that it was founded by a sort of diasporic solidarity ethos, right? Of these Black people coming from the Caribbean, coming from the United States, coming from the Congo River Basin, and then meeting those who were already in this geographic territory. But if you think about the 21st century manifestation of that and the contestations around that, it's not unique at all.
Great, thank you so much. Kirstie's put a question into the chat, and I'll ask you to read the question in a second, Kirstie, but I also wanted to take the chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions myself. Can't resist doing that. And so one question is to Robtel, and the other is actually to everyone to think about. So the first was the one about for Robtel, or maybe it's even for everybody, maybe they're all for everyone to have a think about. So in a sense, we're talking about dual citizenship, and I think we probably, without revealing too much about ourselves, kind of see dual citizenship as a positive feature, as something to move towards, something to be embraced. But I appreciated as well, Robtel, your comments that those who are opposed to dual citizenship have really legitimate concerns, right? They have, it's not that they're just stubborn or it's not a zero, they may see things as a zero-sum game, but they have real grievances, and they feel that somehow embracing dual citizenship is somehow potentially a threat to them in some ways. And I wondered how do you, in your own work, is there a tension, a balance there of trying to be careful not to privilege one side of that debate versus another, even though you have your own personal positions on it? That's the question. And somehow related to that as well is a question around positionality. And most of you have the experience of being kind of insider outsiders. And Robtel, your position, you mentioned that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was criticized for bringing lots of people back from the diaspora, well, including you, actually. And so I wanted to ask about, how did you navigate your own positionality in terms of your research? And Kirstie's got the same thing. She's talking about second generation Ghanaians. She's a second generation Ghanaian, and so I guess the questions of how in your own work you just kind of navigate those positionality questions. that question is inspired by the fact that I was supervising a master's dissertation student today from Zimbabwe, and he was saying, well, how do I talk about my own positionality? And so I was sort of trying to reflect on how does one do that? So any thoughts any of you had would be really helpful. Before you answer that, Kirstie, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and I can't believe I forgot to ask it because it's something that I was thinking a lot about as I was reading the book. So for those of you that aren't familiar, in 2019, the government of Ghana declared that year was the year of return, as a way to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving to the British colonies in what is now the United States. And with that, they are now doing Beyond the Return, which is supposed to be like a 10-year, I guess, to me, I would say it's a 10-year tourism initiative, but it's also being touted as a way for people, not just within the Ghanaian diaspora, but the wider African diaspora to, come home, come to Ghana, visit, live, do business, marry, etc. And people, it's been very well received, especially by people in the African American community. But being privy to, some conversations about, people wanting to create communities for African Americans when they want to come back to live, that will have that will essentially be self-contained. And won't, I wonder about considering Liberia's history. I know it's not, the contexts are not the same, but just considering its history of, African Americans being, I guess, repatriated isn't the right word, but coming to the African continent to live because it's oh, well, you all are all Black, you all will get along. And that, as we currently see, that was not the case. What are your thoughts about this movement that Ghana is doing to bring people to the country?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny, I did a Q&A with the Review of African Political Economy. Hopefully that'll come out next month. And this issue of not necessarily the year of return, but how I'm very, very, I think the ethos with which Liberia was founded, founded on these principles of Black diasporic solidarity and self-rule, very revolutionary and very bold. But I argue throughout the book, and I'm actually quite critical of the operationalization of that, right? So you can't just automatically assume that you can territorialize Black people coming from these very different worldviews, very different experiences, and assume that they're going to get along without systematically and directly reconciling those differences and ensuring that inequalities won't crop up amongst the different groups, right? So there's a point in which I talk about my suspicion of the year of return, that I think it's a very commercial, capitalist driven policy of the Ghanaian government, and how the government of Sierra Leone and the government of Liberia have a more legitimate claim to that kind of return, given the histories of these two countries, that they were founded by, descendants of enslaved people who were in the British colonies, and then descendants of formerly enslaved peoples who were in the United States. So I have to admit, Kirstie, that I'm not sold on the whole idea of the year of return, partially also because of the experiences of Liberian refugees in Ghana, how they've, I go through a whole period, process where I talk about the experience of Liberian refugees as being incredibly unpleasant, and how they view Ghanaians as very, very xenophobic. And I make a point about how Ghana is only welcoming to those particular Black and Brown people who will contribute financially to the political economy of belonging to Ghana. So I think for me, I look at it with quite a bit of suspicion, not only historically, but then also what does it mean for, again, reproducing these kinds of inequalities that might exist from those who are coming from the United States as African Americans, or even those who are coming from other parts of the continent to the continent, or to Ghana specifically. Which brings me back to a question that I think that Natasha asked about, the continuum of the migration mobility continuum, sort of disaggregating respondents. And I tried to do that. Maybe I didn't do it enough, but tried to do that in terms of really pinpointing the experiences of refugees as being very different, even within refugees as being very different from the experiences of those who didn't leave as refugees, how those mobilities And the experience of those mobilities and those migration patterns are quite different. So if you left on a plane before the war to go and study medicine in the United States, your experience of citizenship and your practices of citizenship or Liberian citizenship and your interpretations therein would be very, very different from someone who fled because of an armed conflict, you know what I mean? And had to go through maybe 4 or 5 different countries to get to a Buruburan refugee camp. So I tried to disaggregate based on those migratory flows, and then also the process by which people even moved in the first place. So I hope that answers your question. I want to go back to Laura's question about positionality, and then I would like to hear from each of you as well, because this is something that I really struggled with. I struggled with it because I recognize my own privileges as a transnational actor, as a self-professed transnational actor, and I talk about that. So when I critique the government of Liberia for giving diaspora returnees a significant amount in terms of compensating them for their post-war recovery efforts at the expense of the local actors who are paid significantly less, and the sort of reproducing income inequalities, I say very categorically, I was complicit in that because I did benefit from these top-up capacity building initiatives where high-level or mid-level Liberians came back and got paid significantly, lots and lots and lots. They were paid handsomely for coming back. So I think the way that I handle it is just being very honest about who I was, what I stood for, and then also talking about my interactions with those people, my interlocutors, in which some of them looked at me with quite a bit of suspicion. My American accent and the fact that I was coming from a UK-based university, what does that represent in terms of my own privileges? But what I also did is I made sure that I centered the perspectives of those who had very, very different experiences from me, who had very, very different perspectives from me. And that's how I tried to reconcile my insider-outsider positioning.
Great, thanks. If we're just going to run on for till about 1:45, if that's all right for people, just so that we can hear others. Does anybody else want to dive in and say anything about their own positionality through their work?
I could give it a go.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I basically had a similar experience where I was researching, Zimbabweans in the UK, being a Zimbabwean in the UK, and also going back to Zimbabwe, trying to understand how people view diasporans, also coming from the UK, and sort of what I would say what I tried to do first of all was to, hang on, let me rephrase. When I started writing my thesis, I actually would write we, talking about, people who are in the UK. And then I realized that, there's something wrong here. What is it that is making me feel like that? And I had to actually reflect on my own understanding of who I am and what I represent. And what I experienced when I, visited different groups, say in the UK, was, because of my culture, my identity, my race, it was very easy for me to gain access to people, to start talking about these things. But the moment you, talk about, what you're trying to do, the moment you mention politics and the like, respondents will sort of also respond to that based on, are you talking about politics, or is it a question about, remittances? Because, that is very simple. That is something I can do. So I had to very much from the onset, just say to them, this is who I am, this is what I'm trying to do. Even though I am coming here from, a UK-based institution and I'm researching what you're doing, I'm also a member of these different diaspora organizations, and I work, with some of them doing this and that, so that they just have an understanding of who I am. And when I eventually wrote, basically, I included that. So, in some conversations where people felt like they needed to tell me something. So when I went to Zimbabwe and I was following these networks and I was asking them, I've been told by your partners in the UK that you've been doing this and that. People will sometimes tend to overstate things because they feel like, I'm part of their monitoring and evaluation process or whatever it is. So, I would always try to make sure that I introduce myself in a manner that doesn't necessarily reflect that, and told them that, I am here as part of an academic study, and I don't represent any of those particular thoughts or whatever work they're doing, even if I was part of that organization. And yeah, I tried to, it was very hard, basically. It was very, very difficult to be a part of the group and also to write and reflect in a very honest and neutral way. And I had to rewrite a few of my sections because I felt like I was being overly positive or overly negative based on what I think. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Thabani. That's really interesting. Anyone else care to?
I can go.
Yeah.
So I had 3 field sites: London, New York City, and Accra. And I found that my positionality changed in each field site, and how people reacted to me was different in each field site. London for the most part was okay, with the exception of people making jokes about my accent and things, because I was also a second gen Ghanaian. And I've also been very involved in the second gen Ghanaian community space. So people also, by the time I was ready to do interviews, people kind of knew who I was. They had seen me around, so it was fine. New York, which surprised me, was probably the most difficult place for me to really make inroads with the Ghanaian community and second gen community there, because I found that Ghanaians in New York, in the Bronx specifically, hold on to a very, I guess what they consider to be a very authentic form of Ghanaianness, which is central to being in the Bronx. I am not from the Bronx. I grew up in Northern Virginia. My family has now been in Texas for almost 15 years. So it's different, and that difference was very apparent, to the point where some people, I found out through a friend of mine that was helping me find people to locate, that some of the people I had interviewed viewed me as being white, which is very interesting. And additionally, even though I don't speak our language fluently, but I spoke enough to be able to, I guess, pass the arbitrary test of Ghanaianness that I would be given. But that also comes with the privilege of being an Akan, specifically having an Ashanti surname, which when I went to Ghana, was also having that, I guess, ethnic privilege in addition to class privilege was helpful in some ways, because I was able to get into certain spaces. People could say oh, you have the accent, but your surname, so it's okay. And also being able to interact more with the second gens that had relocated to Ghana that I was there to interview. I think the biggest issue with my positionality in Ghana was class. That was something that I was not really, I hadn't really dealt with before that time. And I say in that part of my dissertation that I wouldn't have been able to do all the things that I did in Ghana if it had not been for my uncle's, what they call houseboy. Actually, I really don't like this, kind of like housekeeper, but that's the term that's used. And just a lot of a lot of unspoken rules around class that me as someone coming from outside, I'm not supposed to take public transportation. I'm not supposed to take church. I'm supposed to take Uber or drop in taxi. But as a student, I didn't have, my finances didn't reach that. But shout out to Royal Geographical Society for funding that part of my dissertation. But yeah, it was very complex. It was very complex, and it was just I was really surprised by how much my positionality moved based on my location.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Anybody else want to weigh in on any of these questions before we close up, or any final questions from those who haven't had a chance to ask anything? Yeah. Okay. We've now run anyway 15 minutes over. So despite our small size, we have obviously plenty of things to talk about. And I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. It's been great to hear as I said, more about people's research, which I don't know much about, as well as even those who I do know very well. So I really want to thank everyone for this really rich conversation, and congratulate Robtel again on getting the book out. And I encourage everyone to read it, order a copy of it. And also I should say this event is a kind of pre-event to next week's Development Studies Association meetings, which are promised to be 3 completely packed days of really rich discussions and panels and networking opportunities, even though we're online. So if if you're available and not yet planning to attend, I would encourage you to do so, and you can find out about that through the developments. I can't remember the website, so just Google Development Studies Association and you'll find all the meeting details. So thanks again very much, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Thanks, James. There's the website right there. All right. So thanks very much, and I hope to see some of you next week as well. Take care.